Hey everyone, so real quick before I get into this video, it turned out way longer than I thought it was going to be, but I'm really happy with how it's all coming out. And like I said, I'm in the middle of editing it now, so I'm going to throw some timestamps down in the description below. So if you are interested specifically about any of the movies on this list, they're going to show up on the screen now. You can check out the timestamps below to hear specifically about that movie if you're not here to check out the entire thing. So I hope you enjoy the video. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Hey everyone, my name is Austin, and this channel is all about digging deeper and going further to better understand faith and film and everything that is in between. If that's exciting to you and you're new here, you can subscribe to my channel for a new video, just like this one, every Friday. After reading a recent post in a movie Facebook group that I'm in, I've been thinking about sequels a lot lately. In this video, I'm going to go through some of my favorite sequels. But before we do that, I think we need to answer the question of what makes a great sequel? Because there's plenty of good sequels out there and there's plenty of bad sequels. There's some in between, but I want to know what actually makes a sequel that is on the positive end of that spectrum. I myself am not an expert, so I did a quick search of what makes a great sequel, and I came up with 4 categories. The first category is to reinvent. That could be the characters, it could be the genre, it could be the story, or even the type of story that it is, but you need to reinvent it in some kind of way. You can't just rehash the same thing a second time around. Next, it is a sequel, so you do need to address previous story arcs, previous plot lines, things that took place in the original that it is based on. Now again, you don't want to rehash all of this stuff, but you need to use that to establish new stakes for this story. Number 3, you need to play with expectations. This one can be a fun part. This could be pretty much anything. I'm going to talk about Alien and Aliens versus Terminator and the Terminator 2 Judgment Day, because those played heavily into expectations for what people really were thinking was going to take place in the movie and what they were hoping for versus what they actually received. And 4th, you gotta add some new characters. I feel like it's definitely a missed opportunity to continue everything with all the same characters. You're reinventing stuff, you're playing with some expectations, and you gotta throw some new characters in there as well. So those are the 4 categories and criteria we're going to look at for each of these sequels that I'm going to go through, so we can talk about what each of these films did to excel in that area. The first sequel we're going to talk about in this video is The Dark Knight. This is a sequel to Batman Begins, and first and foremost, what does this movie do to set itself apart and reinvent itself? First thing, pretty obvious, we have a new character arc. In Batman Begins, Batman is establishing himself as a new presence and hero in Gotham City. At the point of The Dark Knight, he has become an established character, so we have a new character arc for him as he is trying to maintain that status that he has built. Along with him no longer establishing himself, because we now know who he is from the first movie, he is faced with his perfect opposite that we will talk about in just a moment. Next, previous aspects. What previous aspects of Batman Begins reside in The Dark Knight? First, we do still get to see Scarecrow and Falcone, the crime family, in this movie. They play significantly minimal parts compared to what was in the first one, but again, you don't just want to rehash the same stuff over and over again. They still have a presence in the city, which adds to the living, breathing world of Gotham City, but they are not as prominent. But they give us enough of a reminder of what the first movie was, but a different perspective and placement of those characters. Expectations. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head when the first announcement came for The Dark Knight, but obviously expectations were very high. People loved Batman Begins, and the hint at the end of the Joker card for the Joker being the main villain of the second movie sent people's excitement through the roof. When it was announced that Heath Ledger would play the iconic Joker in this movie, I think it did dip some of the expectations, because people were like, Heath Ledger playing the Joker? That was a very unique decision. But Of course, looking back in retrospective on it now was a masterful decision, and Heath Ledger gave the performance of his lifetime. May he rest in peace. Now, moving on to new characters. Obviously, the Joker is a very new character. A lot of the side characters are similar for the most part of what was in the first movie, but I thought it was very smart on Christopher Nolan's part, the writer and director of The Dark Knight, to hold probably the most iconic Batman villain to the second movie. It gives us a chance to establish the new Batman character because this was very different from previous incarnations of the character, and to fully understand his motivation, what makes him tick, that kind of stuff, not distracting or taking away from any of that with the main villain. Not to say Scarecrow is a weak villain by any means, but if you compare what we ended up with of the Joker character in The Dark Knight, it may have overshadowed that introduction of Batman in the new reincarnation we did receive in Batman Begins. I appreciate that Bruce and Batman's origin is given center stage in Batman Begins, and then adding in the Joker takes it to a whole new level in the sequel. The next movie we're going through, Aliens. This is obviously the sequel to Alien, singular, not plural. And what sets Aliens apart from its predecessor is very cool, in my opinion. They literally genre swapped the movie for the sequel. They took the very intimate and isolating alien horror movie, sci-fi horror movie, and took that formula and developed it into a action-heavy, high-stakes, high adrenaline movie. It still maintains those elements of the original, but it reinvented it in a way that very much paid off and helped that movie to thrive and elevate to an extremely high level, being considered one of the greatest sci-fi action movies ever made. As far as previous aspects go, from Alien to Aliens, the consequences of the first movie carry over into the sequel. We aren't given necessarily a continuation that picks up exactly where it left off. With Ripley going into the cryosleep bed and waking up years and years later, now everything that happened for her did not happen for anyone else in the movie. So they progressed as if nothing had happened, where for her, her entire perspective and life had changed because of the events in Alien. And that is a clash of beliefs and perspective that very well pays off and is very well explored throughout the story. Because no one else went through what she went through in the first movie, they do not understand why she's so scared and terrified of what could possibly happen with everything going on of the colonies and the settlement now on the alien xenomorphs worlds. Expectations. This is one of the really fun ones for this movie in particular, because this movie very, very well played with the expectations of the audience going into it. Think just from the character of the androids in Alien and Aliens. Ash, later revealed in the movie to be the villain, caused the audience to think, there's an android in Aliens. He's probably the villain. And instead, James Cameron took that character, and though he causes you to think it could veer in that direction, instead he becomes a hero. And then also with expectations, I obviously was not alive during the time of these movies being released, so I did not see the one and wait years to see the other later. But I'm sure expectations were not to the point of knowing that it was going to be years later from the first versus the second one, only being a moment really for Ripley's character. So that is another really cool expectation that was played with for this movie to enhance the story and really put it on a bigger scale. As far as new characters go, I already mentioned Bishop is a really cool addition to the cast. Newt as well, giving Ripley the chance to be a maternal figure for someone who she didn't know but lost that in what happened in the first movie is an excellent decision. And obviously, all of the Colonial Marines are a welcome addition to the cast. Their banter and action and reactions to everything going on are just excellent and thrilling the whole runtime. Terminator 2 Judgment Day might be the movie on this list that reinvented the most compared to its predecessor. It reinvented its characters. Sarah Connor is no longer a scared young woman who is terrified at everything that is going on, but is now a strong and powerful, very capable woman faced with all of these horrible, dangerous things that are going on. She has become a fierce warrior, and this change in her character's personality very much deepens the world building of this story. As far as previous aspects go from the first movie carried over to the second, it's cool that we obviously know everything that happened in the first movie, so we are on the same page as Sarah Connor and her character and where she is once she is to the point of she's now in an insane asylum because everyone thinks she's crazy because she thinks robots are going to take over the world and bring apart the apocalypse. And it's cool seeing that story of the first movie from two different perspectives. One of reality and science, and one of someone who might be crazy in science fiction. There's also returning actors as different characters. Arnold Schwarzenegger plays another Terminator, but this time he has been reprogrammed and is no longer the villain, but a protector and hero figure. Expectations. Now, going along with my point I just made about Arnold Schwarzenegger, people did not know leading up to this movie, I found this out recently listening to a movie podcast where they were talking about Judgment Day, that people did not know leading up to this movie that Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator in Judgment Day was not going to be a villain. Everyone assumed it was just another one and another villain that they would have to face off against. Little did they know, about 20 minutes into the movie, everything would be switched and he is actually the hero. Now, I kind of consider not as much Sarah Connor a new character because obviously she's just developed as far as what has happened to her over the past few years. But John Connor is obviously a new character because he was only conceived in the first movie. And now he is a new character that we get to follow along the way. Aside from some puberty screeches, he's a pretty cool guy and very welcome addition to the cast as he gets to teach Arnold Schwarzenegger's reprogrammed Terminator what it means to be human. Terminator 2 Judgment Day might be the movie on this list that uses that uses previously utilized actors from the first movie and the second to be completely different characters the most, and it's really well done. Spider-Man 2 is next. Now, what's interesting about this one is this trilogy as a whole. The sequels don't differentiate themselves too much from their predecessors. They're, for the most part, a continuous story, not necessarily each one picking up exactly where the previous led off, but they're within a few weeks, a few months apart each, and they're mostly the same thing. But that doesn't mean it's a bad sequel, obviously. In the category of previous aspects, Norman Osborn or Green Goblin's death at the end of the first movie heavily plays into Harry Osborn's character arc going forward. And it really messes things up for Peter and Harry's relationship in the second movie. And though there are a lot of the same characters, this development really enhances the story. As far as expectations go, Spider-Man 1 is great. Spider-Man 2 I still remember seeing in the theaters with my grandfather, I think opening week. I was so excited that he wanted to take me to go see it. And the great thing about these two movies in particular is Spider-Man 1 sets up and does a great job with pretty much everything it does. And the second one comes in and pretty much just perfects the formula. Anything that might have been like, in the first movie, just completely wiped. And it is perfected with its sequel. Looking at new characters, obviously we have Dr. Octopus, which is still, in my opinion, one of the greatest movie villains we've had. And also Dr. Connors, who Peter relies on for some advice in different parts, somewhat in the third movie as well. But he is another really cool addition because he is another mentor for Peter to look up to. So all that to say, Spider-Man 2 doesn't do a ton with the four categories we're looking at, necessarily to change things up, but it does enough well to enhance and continue the story, to change up just enough that, as I mentioned, it perfects a lot of what was set up in the first one. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is one of my favorite sequels of all time, and the newer Planet of the Apes trilogy is one of my favorite trilogies of all time. So, what does Dawn do to set itself apart from Rise of the Planet of the Apes? This is very drastic because the world has completely changed. For the most part, Rise of the Planet of the Apes takes place in a very familiar world to its audience. But when it comes to the sequel, it basically turns into a post-apocalyptic sci-fi Shakespeare epic, really. Aside from a few characters, this movie is completely different from the first movie while still utilizing and embracing the important aspects of the story and what took place in the first movie to affect what happens in the sequel. Looking at the previous aspects of the first movie, Caesar's upbringing in the first movie has shaped his leadership in the sequel. He frequently reflects back on his childhood and upbringing when it comes to making decisions for his family. Maurice and Rocket are also welcome returns, and Koba, though Koba was barely noticed in the first one, just a little bit here and there. But it was cool that they took these characters who were kind of side characters in the first one, and they're main characters, I would say, because they're very much advisors to Caesar and best friends, and it very much takes the characters that were set up with a few little details here and there, and now we're given a full kind of character stretch of who these people are. Expectations leading up to this movie, I didn't see Rise of the Planet of the Apes in the theaters. I got on board with that later on DVD. I think I rented it from the library. But leading up to the second movie, I was very excited. This was one of the first movies I saw twice in the theaters within like days or a week. I don't think anyone quite expected this movie to be as good as it was. When it came out, it just blew up of everything that this movie stood on from the foundation of the first movie to elevate itself to such a higher and more complex level and do so well. Now, new characters. I did mention Koba is very minimal in the first movie, but he is taken and developed into the main villain of the second movie. Now, there's other villains as well, but he's the most prominent villain in this story, and his character arc and relationship with Caesar is very convicting and very convincing as well. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is one of those near-perfect examples of how to take what works in the first one and take it to an incredibly astounding level in the sequel. 10 Cloverfield Lane is another very interesting one to look at of the original versus the sequel, because these movies are very different and a lot of people probably wouldn't consider one a sequel to the other. Jumping right into also previous aspects, each Cloverfield movie is very different from the other. And again, a lot of people wouldn't consider them to necessarily be like a trilogy or any of them to be a sequel to the other. They connect in very minute, small ways. And between the first and the second one, it's likely that the monster is pretty much the only strand that connects these two movies for the most part, but it's still done very well and puts it to the point that I wanted to mention it in this video. Expectations. This is another one I think not a lot of people knew what to expect. People very much liked, for the most part, the original Cloverfield movie and everything that it did. It was a unique style, a fun story, kind of fun in a certain way. And then this trailer came out for the second one, and it was completely different. Nothing like the original. We went from a big found footage monster movie to a very contained and intimate thriller, almost horror movie. And then jumping right to characters, all the characters are new. Nothing that was in the first movie is in the second movie, aside from the title, really. And I think that's amazing, that a movie can do a sequel that takes place in the same universe, but is very much its own standalone thing. This is something that can be said about the next one too. Next is BladeRunner 2049. Now, the really cool thing about these movies is I've only seen each of them once, and I'm not a huge fan of the original. I do want to go back and watch it again because I think I might like it on a rewatch, but I did very much like Blade Runner 2049. So what sets these two movies apart? Obviously, 30 or 40 years is the obvious thing. But aside from that, this sequel has a completely separate story from the original. Obviously, this movie is Deckard has disappeared from the original, played by Harrison Ford, and Kay, played by Ryan Gosling, is a new Blade Runner that we are introduced to. And we follow him along with his journey, and it is very cool that we get to follow a separate character, but it's still, going into previous aspects, takes place in Los Angeles, still the near future city, and all that the world is within that, but following this new character from a different point of view gives us a different perspective on the city and on the characters. Looking into previous aspects, obviously Deckard, played by Harrison Ford, as I mentioned, returns, but what's really cool is he plays the side character in this one. He's still really great in the movie, but the movie focuses on Kay, played by Ryan Gosling. So it's cool that Harrison Ford's character comes back, but he doesn't overshadow the characters in the story that are being told in the sequel. Expectations. Now, as I mentioned, I've only seen each of these movies once, and that was just in the past year, so I don't know a ton about the expectations. Based on what research I've done, I know Blade Runner is praised as one of the best sci-fi movies ever made, and so there were tons of expectations going into this one. And I saw an interview with Denis Villeneuve, the director of this movie, and he said he had to set aside all of those expectations. He was asked about the insurmountable pressure of making this sequel, and he said, I had to set that aside. He said, it will obviously be compared to that movie, but I wanted to do my own thing. And I think that was a brilliant choice on his part, and really paid off in the end for what he did and accomplished through this film. I've already mentioned Kay as one of the new characters for this movie, played very well by Ryan Gosling, and then we also were introduced to Joy. Now there's other characters as well. I wanted to talk about these two primarily. Joy is played by Ana de Armas, who just recently was in the new Knives Out movie, but both of them give great performances and give us a very interesting story to follow throughout this film. And everything is done so well to set this movie apart, reinvent itself and what it is doing, giving us new characters, and all of that makes for one of the best sequels that I've ever seen. Now, before I wrap this up, I want to know from you, what are some of your favorite sequels, and what do you think they do so well to set themselves apart and meet these criteria that differentiates the neutral or bad sequels from the good and great ones? Share your thoughts in the comments down below. I look forward to hearing other people's thoughts and perspectives. And as always, thank you for sticking around to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like it, make sure you're subscribed, and share it with someone who you know will enjoy it just as much as you did. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next video.